Sorry, my wife has been Zooming here and changed my arrangement. Always blame the wife.
She may always blame the husband, Dr. Nick.
Yeah, well, that's where I get it. Okay.
All right. Well, we welcome Dr. Nick to our Sundays. We are so fortunate to have him. It's Dr. Nick just completed a Discovering Buddhism spiritual teacher with us, and it's just so amazing. And to have him come back again so soon is we're just so fortunate, because Dr. Nick has been he's spent his life working for our gurus. Dr. Nick, if you don't know him and didn't attend Thursday's class, he is a medical doctor, and in his youth, shortly after becoming a doctor, took a trip around Asia, met the Lamas, and the rest, as they say, is history. And if you have ever read any of our FPMT Dharma books by Lama Yeshe or Lama Zopa Rinpoche, you can be pretty sure that Dr. Nick had a hand in it. And he's been so busy with these other things. And he was director of Kurukula Center for twice. And so it's just a rare opportunity, like the turtle with the golden yolk, that we get to see him giving a teaching. So just thank you, Dr. Nick. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, I got to say, Ursel is a hard act to follow. So I think it was a pretty successful event yesterday, right?
We hope so. Yes, I think so, yes.
Well, you had people from all over the world, I think.
Yes, we had about 350 on Zoom, and then we had Facebook Live. I'm not sure how many people were on there.
Yeah, I was on that. It was about 50 or 60, it looked like, you know. So, yeah, you should do it again.
We will. We hope.
Okay, so we just have a few weeks here to take us out to the end of the year, basically, I guess, or to Christmas anyway. And as advertised, we'll be doing a quick run through Lama Tsongkhapa's short Stages of the Path text called Foundation of All Good Qualities. And the Foundation of All Good Qualities refers to our spiritual teacher as the foundation of all good qualities. So, and that's the first line of the text. So often Tibetan texts get their title from the first line of the text. Well, I don't know, often, sometimes. But before we start, let's just do a couple of minutes short meditation on the breath, just to kind of center our minds. And then we'll begin. So just sit comfortably in your favorite meditation posture. And bring your mind in away from external objects of distraction. And once inside, keep it away from internal objects of distraction, mainly the discursive, chattering mind, scattering mind that wants to run everywhere. Find your breath where it goes out and comes in through your nostrils. And then focus on your mind at the entrance of your nostrils, your breath going out, coming in. And just keep it there for a couple of minutes. Don't let it wander. Okay, so hopefully our minds are a little calmer and clearer. So look into your mind and clarify your intention for being here this morning. So our motivation for doing anything is very important in terms of whether that action that we're doing becomes positive, cause of happiness, or negative, cause of suffering. So since we don't want to suffer, we should make sure that we have a positive intention, a positive motivation. And not just positive motivation, but the highest positive motivation. So think, the purpose of my life is to lead all sentient beings from suffering to enlightenment. In order to do that, first I have to reach enlightenment myself. Reaching enlightenment depends on studying, practicing, and accomplishing the path to enlightenment, the stages of the path to enlightenment, all the steps and stages. Therefore, I'm going to participate in this session, looking at the entire path to enlightenment as encompassed by this short prayer by Lama Tsongkhapa, the great Tibetan saint and yogi, the foundation of all good quality, all good qualities. So like that, we set our motivation that we're here in order to reach enlightenment, not for ourselves, not only for ourselves, but in order to benefit all sentient beings. So is this the first time for anybody? Has everyone had teachings on Buddhism before? I can't see everybody, but what do you think, Rebecca?
There's a few names that I don't recognize, but they may be other students of yours that, so if anyone, if this is your first time, if you would just, you can do the raise your hand little, or feel free to unmute yourself and say, this is my first time. Okay, so yes, we have one person who this is their first Buddhist teaching. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Who's that? I couldn't see.
Métis, I don't know if you want to say hello, Métis. If you don't, that's fine.
Hello, guys. Thanks for, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for taking me in this class. It is my first time in this teaching, so I'm very excited. Thank you.
Okay, well, you know, curb your enthusiasm, but let's see how it goes. So most of us have had some exposure before. So, Matey, if there's anything, anybody actually, if there's at any time you want to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to do so. This is quite informal.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. So, you know, I think we have a rough idea, or a very good idea in some cases, of where this Buddhist teaching comes from. It comes from the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, who was born in India some 2,600 years ago, and as a prince to a very powerful royal family, and rather than take over the kingdom, he had some experiences which caused him to wonder about the purpose and meaning of life. So he actually left the palace and went in search of the truth. He studied with many Hindu teachers. I don't think it was called Hinduism back then, but the teachings that we now know as Hinduism. He studied with those a wide variety of Indian teachers who were around at the time, and when he felt that he had learned everything they had to teach but still hadn't realized the truth, he thought he had to go off and do it for himself, which he did, and he accomplished his goal, and he had a breakthrough experience where he perceived directly the nature of reality, but ultimate and conventional, to levels of reality, and attained what we call awakening or enlightenment in a place called Bodh Gaya in India. Bodh is the Sanskrit root for awakening. Bodhi is awakened wisdom, B-O-D-H-I. Bodh Gaya is the place near Gaya where he achieved this. It's in sort of northeast India. So then it was sort of an experience beyond words, really, and he didn't feel he could convey the experience adequately, so he didn't tell anybody about it for a while. He just wandered he went little northwest, and he finished up in a place called Sarnath, near Varanasi, or Benares back then. And there he encountered some friends who he'd studied with the Hindu gurus, and they recognized something profound had happened to him, asked him what had happened, and asked him to teach. So he gave his first teaching, which we know as the Four Noble Truths, where he taught that conditioned existence is suffering, that this suffering has a cause. The cause can be eliminated so that we can achieve the cessation of suffering, and he taught the path to that result. So the four truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. So the path is taught in different ways in different Buddhist traditions. Buddhism, he started gathering more and more followers at that time after giving that first teaching. And then eventually, over the centuries, Buddhism spread to other neighboring countries, to Sri Lanka to the south, and then Southeast Asia to the east, and it actually went west to as far as Afghanistan, what we know as Afghanistan now, and maybe even further west than that, and north to Nepal and China, Korea, Japan, and then a little bit later to Tibet, and then in recent centuries to the west. So Buddhism spread all over, and the path is, and different Buddhist traditions developed in these different countries, conditioned by the various cultures that it found itself in. And in Tibet, after a bit of coming and going, the essence of the teaching crystallized into this path we call the graduated path to enlightenment, or Lam Rim in Tibetan. Lam means path, Rim means stage, so it's stages or steps of the path. And this arrangement of the Buddha's teachings, which didn't introduce any new teachings, any teachings that the Buddha himself hadn't given. It just took the 40 years of teachings that the Buddha gave, which, how can I say, he gave it, I want to say haphazardly, but that sounds a little negative. When the Buddha taught, he taught according to the needs of his audience, the people in front of him. So if he had beginners in front of him, he gave beginners teachings. If he had people with some exposure in front of him, he gave slightly more advanced teachings. If he had advanced practitioners in front of him, he gave advanced teachings like that. And so when you look at the whole body of work, as an individual wanting to sort of understand and practice this path, it could look a little confusing, knowing, well, which of these 40 years of teachings applies to me? How do I start? Where do I start? So this great Indian teacher called Atisha was invited to Tibet to restore Buddhist teachings after they degenerated a little after some centuries in Tibet, about 1,000 years ago. Atisha was invited to Tibet, and he wrote a text called A Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. Maybe one day we can do that. But that became the first Lamrim text and served as the basis for many, many other Lamrim texts. It was a relatively short text, I think 67 or 68 verses. Actually, when you say that, it doesn't seem so short, but compared to 3 volumes of this, Lama Tsongkhap was a great Lamrim. So we've got a short, how many verses in the foundation, 9 or 10 or something. There are 3 volumes of this, or there's 5 volumes of Geshe Zopa's commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo, Geshe Zopa, one of our teachers, and this Pabonka Rinpoche's text, 1,000 pages. So, Lamp for the Path compared to those extensive commentaries is relatively short. But it laid out the path of, it arranged the Buddha's teachings in a step-like progression that's kind of psychologically logical and something that is studied. So when we study the Lamrim, at first it's good to breeze through the whole thing fairly quickly, just so that we have an idea of the scope of these teachings, and the various topics that are contained within it. And these short Lamrim texts, like the Foundation of All Good Qualities, they're sometimes called glance meditations. So you see the whole path at a glance. And that's what we're going to do here for the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I sent you does everybody have the link to?
I will post it in the chat, and also after class, I'll email everyone links to all of the texts that Dr. Nick has referenced. It was on the calendar, if you saw there, this link, but I'll post it now in the chat.
Yeah, so I was, as Rebecca said, that I was practicing medicine in Australia in the 60s and early 70s, and for various reasons got a bit disillusioned with medicine. It's too long a story to tell you here, but too long. So my girlfriend and I decided to spend 4 years traveling the world. So we set off in May 72, and after a few months we found ourselves in Nepal, and I'd gotten a little interested in Buddhism in Thailand, seeing monks and temples and Buddha statues and so forth, and doing a little reading at that time, sort of whetted my interest in finding out more about Buddhism. And when I got to Kathmandu, a friend mentioned a meditation course starting the following week at a small monastery called Kopan, just outside of Kathmandu, near Boudhanath. Kathmandu, the city here, then on one side there's the famous stupa of Swayambhu Nath, and on the other side there's a famous stupa of Boudhanath. So, stupas are, I don't think you can see one, there's one just there, but there are these pagoda-like pointed structures that represent the enlightened mind of the Buddha. A lot can be said about stupas. Kopan is near the stupa to the northeast of Kathmandu. And Kopan Monastery is about a half an hour walk from there. So we took this 1 month meditation course, and that was it as far as the rest of my life was concerned. We finished up staying there for, I finished up staying there for 5 years. And after a year or so, I became a monk, girlfriend became a nun. And then she went back to Australia and ran the centre. The Lamas started there in 1974. And I stayed on at Kopan, mainly editing and, transcribing and editing the Lama's teachings and publishing little pamphlets and commentaries and so on there. And that sort of pretty much set the tone for the next almost 50 years of my life. So in 1975, there were a bunch of us Westerners who'd become monks and nuns living at Kopan at that point. And the great teacher, Khunu Lama Rinpoche, came to visit Kathmandu. He normally lived in India. And he was one of the important teachers of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he gave us a couple of teachings. He was staying near Boudhanath, this stupa, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our teacher, took us down to receive a couple of teachings from him. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated, and one of the teachings was a commentary on the foundation of all good qualities. So I just thought, there are a lot of blessings from this text because of Khunu Lama Rinpoche's association with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, without whom we wouldn't be here, and the translation by our great teacher Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and just the power of this text itself by Lama Tsongkhapa, who is the founder of our tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, as it developed over the centuries, there were no roads or anything, so different parts of the country were quite isolated from each other, and different teachers appeared or arose or developed in different places, and the ones who were the most powerful, I guess you'd say, developed greater and greater followings, and different schools or traditions of Buddhism developed around these teachers and then their descendants. And it kind of shook out to about 4 main traditions, 4 or 5 main traditions today. And so the original one, the ancient one, is called the Nyingma. So that started back in the 8th century. And a couple of the others, Sakya and Kagyu traditions, started, I think, in around the 11th century. And then our tradition, the Gelug tradition, Lama Tsongkhapa started around the 14th, 15th century. So like that. So this text is by the founder of our tradition, and because I was present at this particular teaching, that also because of the qualities of Khunu Lama Rinpoche and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that has some blessings from that also. Okay, so I think we only have 2 or 3 weeks, 3 weeks or so. So let's just launch into it. So I'll just read what Khunu Lama says and then, make some dumb comments. So Rinpoche says, the ultimate purpose of listening to teachings is to receive enlightenment. So it's already what we said before. Therefore, before listening to or reading this teaching on the foundation of all good qualities, it's necessary to cultivate the pure thought of bodhicitta, the main cause of enlightenment. Well, we did that too. So when I said, the purpose of our life is to reach enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, then that's the beginning of generating bodhicitta. Bodhi, as I said, means awakening. Citta means mind. So literally it's the mind of awakening, the mind of enlightenment, enlightenment mind, bodhicitta, C-I-T-T-A is citta, or C-H-I-T-T-A. And any action that we do motivated by bodhicitta becomes a cause of reaching enlightenment. So, one of the things that we're encouraged to do is to become very familiar with this, with the mind of bodhicitta, with the thought of bodhicitta. I don't have it right here, but in fact, Wisdom Publications have just published a book called Bodhicitta by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, which is a really important book for becoming familiar with bodhicitta, its importance, and how, the benefits of developing it and how to develop it in our mind. So that book is highly recommended. So we've done that already. We've tried to develop the thought of bodhicitta by saying that we're doing this session this morning in order to reach enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. So then Rinpoche says, the ultimate, we receive enlightenment only by practicing Dharma. Without practicing Dharma, there's no way to receive enlightenment. Enlightenment can be received only through the practice of Dharma. So he's making that point pretty strongly there. There are 2 types of Dharma, outer and inner. Inner Dharma means Buddhadharma. That's the teachings of the Buddha. Outer Dharma refers to the non-Buddhist religions, the religions followed by non-Buddhists. Of these, there are 5 divisions. We don't need to go into that. By practicing outer, there is a footnote here that explains what they are. By practicing outer Dharma, you can receive only temporary samsaric pleasures, but you cannot receive enlightenment. To become enlightened, you have to practice inner Dharma, Buddhadharma. So Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, Dharma is a Sanskrit word, and its meaning, or the connotation of Dharma, is that which sustains, or that which holds us up, that which keeps us up out of suffering. So suffering's down here, and the Dharma keeps us up out of suffering. So any action that keeps us out of suffering is a Dharma action. Any action that creates suffering or causes us to suffer is not a Dharma action. And so, a large part of the practice, the understanding and practice, is what's the border between Dharma and non-Dharma? you know, what's the dividing line? So the dividing line isn't out there. Dividing line is within our mind. And essentially it comes down to our motivation. So, you know, we have, generally speaking, two kinds of motivation, positive and negative. Positive motivation, like bodhicitta, brings the result of happiness. Negative motivation brings the result, the experience of suffering. So we need to know what's going on in our mind to know if we're creating the cause of happiness, which we want, so it's called positive, or we're creating the cause of suffering, which we don't want, which is negative.
Dr. Nick, may I ask a question?
Certainly.
So in talking about motivation, does it matter if, I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, if the motivation is authentic, as in, I mean, as we can see without going into any details at all, but in our political situation now, I think that, you know, there's, if you want to limit it to two sides, there's probably a lot more than that. But if you limit it to two sides, I think that on both sides of the opposite, you know, they're totally polar opposites, but that many people, their motivation is to bring happiness to themselves and others. So how do we know what, I mean, doesn't it matter if your motivation is diluted or it's, I mean, I'm probably not expressing myself clearly, but do you understand what I'm asking?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Go on.
Well, so that's what I'm asking. So if people are doing two totally opposite actions, but their motivation from their side, they believe it to be for good, then what is the effect on the action or the karma of it? Like what's the qualifications for motivation to be positive motivation to be a positive action?
Right, okay. So look, everybody or nearly everybody is doing what they do in order to be happy. And people think they are doing. So what people think they're doing doesn't necessarily mean that's what they're doing. That's going to be the result. And in fact, I think if we look at the world today, or almost ever really, people are wrong, you know, I mean, you know, and everybody is suffering. I mean, so when the Buddha taught, gave the very first teaching, the truth of suffering, suffering isn't what we normally think of suffering. Suffering we normally think of is just very gross suffering, superficial level of suffering. Yeah, you know, pain, hunger, thirst, heat, cold, illness, old age, death, not getting what you want, losing what you have, encountering unfavorable circumstances. I mean, all kinds of things that we don't want, things that when we're experiencing it, we wish it had stopped. And the reason why we experience all these things is because while we thought we were creating the cause not to experience those things, in fact, we were creating the cause to experience those things. So that's just the gross level of suffering. And he taught 3 levels of suffering, the Buddha. And the second level of suffering is more difficult to recognize as suffering. It's technically called changeable suffering. But even though it's actually suffering, we don't recognize it as suffering. We call it happiness. So that's what Khunu Lama just mentioned here. By practicing outer Dharma, you can receive only temporary samsaric pleasures, but you cannot receive enlightenment. So samsaric pleasures, samsara, the adjective samsaric, samsara is this world we live in, not this external world like Earth, Milky Way, galaxy, all that. Samsara is life led under the control of delusion and karma. So it's and that was what the Buddha called the third level of suffering, pervasive suffering. So as long as we have a body and mind that are under the control of delusion and karma, we're always bound to experience one level of suffering or the other. So gross suffering is the suffering all those sufferings that I mentioned before, that we recognize as suffering, that even animals recognize as suffering, and try to avoid. The second level of suffering, changeable suffering, which we call happiness, is not true happiness. It's relative happiness, it's relative pleasure, like having a cool drink on a hot day, but it's not real happiness. For example, it looks like it's a nice day, so let's go to the beach. So we go to the beach, and well, I don't know if we're allowed to go to the beach these days, but let's go back a year and say we were. So you go to the beach, and it's it's sunny, so we lie down on our towel and start warming up, and after a while we start to feel too hot, so we go into the water, and the water's nice and cool, and we feel, that's nice, that's good. So we register that as pleasure, because the suffering of being too hot has been eliminated by the cool water. But it hasn't really been eliminated. It's just been suppressed. And as we stay in the water, as soon as we go in the water, even though we register the feeling of cool as pleasure, as happiness, actually it's not really happiness. What has happened is the suffering of being too hot has finished, but the suffering of being too cold has just started. But because it's very small, we don't recognize it as suffering. We think it's pleasure. But if we stay in the water, I mean, I don't know about Florida, but the longer you stay in the water, the colder and colder you get, until you can't stand it. It's too cold. So so that the pleasure of being cool has turned into the suffering of being cold. So then you get out. So getting out, the sun comes down, you feel, that's nice. This is pleasure. Now the suffering of being cold has finished, but what started again is the suffering of being too hot. But because it's very small, we don't recognize it as suffering because our minds are, a bit thick. So, but we stay in the sun again. So this is our life, up and down, chasing the perfect happiness, but never finding it. And so whether it's eating or listening to music or, a favorite breakfast cereal, I mean, if you do it too much, it turns into suffering. So it changes into suffering. It's changeable suffering. So it's not So these experiences of neutralizing one suffering by another, that's samsaric existence. That's temporal pleasure. That's samsaric pleasure. It's not real pleasure. It's just less suffering. It's suffering in disguise. But we always chase it. We spend our whole life chasing it, you know. So we're actually chasing suffering. And it's because our mind and body are pervaded by pervasive suffering, by our being under the control of delusion and karma. So what's delusion and karma? That's what people asked the Buddha. When he explained about suffering, people understood it. You know, these three levels of suffering, they were like, well, why? Why is life like this? Why is life suffering? Why do we have to go through this, you know, these sufferings of aging, illness and death and all these other things, pain, injury, so on and so forth. So he taught the second truth. And this was the Buddha's skill, that to teach. So, you know, the logical mind thinks, well, when you're talking about cause and effect, first you explain the cause and then you explain the effect, because that's the chronological association. But in fact, the Buddha taught the disease first, so people would recognize they have the disease, and then they look for then they want to know what's the cause. So then he explained the cause of these three levels of suffering: delusion and karma. And it's the same with the second the second set of two truths: the cessation of suffering and the path to the cessation of suffering. You know, if he just taught suffering and its cause, I mean, that'd be pretty depressing. That, I mean, this is it. This is life. Life is suffering. And so people are going to ask the next, well, is there a way out? Can it stop? So then he taught the cessation of suffering. Yes, it can stop. How can it stop? It's because it has a cause, and the cause can be eliminated. And if you eliminate the cause, you can't have the result. So then he taught the result of cessation of suffering, and then people want to know, well, how do you get there? So then he taught the path. So these are the four truths, and the reason he taught them in the particular order that he did. I mean, if you go to the doctor and the doctor looks and says, okay, we'll take these tablets, you go, well, why? I mean, first you've got to know what your illness is, or if you're ill at all. And so if you have the diagnosis, you've got TB, then take this medicine, you know. So it's kind of like that. So delusion and karma. I mean, if we get technical about it, there are 6 principal delusions and 20 secondary delusions. So there are kind of 26 delusions in all, but they're condensed into 3 main delusions. And so the Buddha called them the 3 poisonous minds, or the 3 poisons, you know, ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And attachment and aversion come from ignorance. So the root delusion, you know, the very fundamental cause of all our suffering, pervasive suffering, the changeable suffering, the suffering of suffering, you know, gross suffering, these all come from the root of ignorance. So ignorance itself has two main divisions. There's ignorance of ultimate reality, the way in which things actually exist. Ignorance of ultimate reality and ignorance of conventional reality, or the way things work on the relative level. So ultimate and relative. So again, ignorance of ultimate reality is also divided into two. There's ignorance of the ultimate reality of the self, of ourselves, of the me, the I. We all have that. We all feel I very strongly. I'm pointing at my chest. That's where all the suffering comes from. But the ignorance of ultimate reality is the ignorance of the ultimate reality of all other phenomena, of other people, of other sentient beings, of physical phenomena, of the universe, everything else. So we feel our I, our self, is this sort of permanent, unchanging entity within us. Again, that can be divided into two as well. Sort of the innate ignorance of self, this belief in the self, this feeling of self that we're born with, that all animals, insects, all other samsaric sentient beings have. And there's also a philosophically derived ignorance of self, where certain philosophical teachings will talk about a soul or an immortal soul, or as a sort of as a some kind of entity within us that can go to heaven or go to hell, like that. So whether it's that one or the innate one with which we're born, both don't exist. But our ignorance believes that it exists, this I, this self that we're born with, that we've had actually within our mind, within our consciousness since beginningless time. So that's another thing we want to look at. Mental continuity. Where does it come from, this ignorance? But if you want to get a quick understanding of it, you just think, well, when we talk to people, say, well, last week I did this, last year I did that, or I was practicing medicine in Australia, I went here, I went there. Next week I'm going to do this, next week I'm going to do that. As if there's, a driver in this car that is always there, that doesn't change. This I, this me. I, myself, and mine, wasn't it? Ursula was talking about it yesterday. So this is the fundamental ignorance, that the I exists. There is a self, there is a person, but it does not exist as the way we've always believed it to exist, as the way we continue to believe it exists. We believe there's a permanent, independent, self-existent, inherently existent I. And out there are inherently existent phenomena, all these things we see, and experience. The Buddha taught there is no such thing as inherent existence, independent existence. Everything is dependent. Everything is interdependent. And if you look at what a person is, say we look at ourself, because this ignorance of the self is, the fundamental ignorance. What is a person? What is a sentient being? It's a combination of body and mind. That is it. There is no third entity like a soul or a self or a permanent thing within the body and the mind. So what is the body? Well, we know what the body is. It's physical. It's made of molecules and atoms, and the atoms are made of, I don't know, my physics goes back 60 or 70 years, so I don't know what they teach now, but we had a nucleus and electrons and protons and neutrons and I don't know what is there now, quarks, and I've got no idea. So, but there's nothing really solid within it. It's all just a combination of parts. Frank Zappa put it best. He said, everything is just one big note. This is all vibrating, So, well, I don't know, but that's not really a scriptural reference, but if you look at the body, further and further down, we just see that it's just energy, and mass and energy are interchangeable. These things that look solid eventually will disintegrate into non-physical, not obviously physical matter. It's still potentially physical, because when matter disintegrates, it doesn't disappear. I think Einstein taught us that, didn't he? Mass and energy interchangeable. It just dissolves into its constituent tiny particles, and then eventually they can coalesce again and form more obvious matter again. But it doesn't disappear. So it's just changing state. So that's physical matter, that's our body. So within that, there is nothing that's a permanent self. You can't find the I, the permanent I, in the body. I've dissected a few bodies in my time. I've never found an I. Not that I was looking for it back then, but, like a little, see these monoliths appearing everywhere. So there's this little monolithic I somewhere. It doesn't exist. So if it's not in the body, if it exists, it must be in the mind. So what is the mind? According to the Buddha, the mind is a phenomenon or an entity that can be described very simply in two words. Clear and knowing. Clear means the mind is formless, like empty space, like a vacuum. This space around us isn't really empty. It has oxygen, thank goodness. But you think of empty space, formless, a vacuum. The mind is formless. It has no shape. It has no color. It doesn't have any molecules floating around in it or atoms. Mind is completely formless, like empty space. But it's not empty space because it has the second property of knowing. I mean, these are the technical terms, clear and knowing. So it's formless and it has the ability to perceive objects, like a mirror can reflect things. So the mind is clear and knowing, has the ability to perceive objects. And the mind isn't a kind of a static thing. The mind is basically a series of thought moments. We call it the stream of consciousness. That's what it is. It's like a stream, like a river. It's never still for the shortest fraction of a second, constantly changing. One thought after another, one mind moment after another. Sort of like, you know, falling dominoes. And if you really look at the mind, there's nothing there really that isn't either the thought moment that just finished or the one that hasn't come yet. There's no permanent little chunk of mind that you can point to and say, ah, this is the mind. Here it is. So just like the body, the mind is this constantly changing, impermanent phenomenon. Now, when we talk about it, when Buddhism talks about impermanence, you know, there are, again, two levels. You know, there's gross impermanence and subtle impermanence. So gross impermanence is what we see happening to our bodies. You know, maybe mine more than yours, but you know, or what happens to a house or a car. You know, it gradually gets old and falls apart. So that's kind of gross impermanence. You know, we see that happening, the changing seasons. We see gross impermanence happening all around us all the time. Subtle impermanence is more subtle. We don't notice that. We don't feel. You know, if you know, you look in the mirror and yesterday morning, you look in the mirror this morning, pretty much you recognize yourself, you look the same. Or you walk into a room and it looks the same as yesterday, nothing's changed. Actually, everything's changed. All these things around us, they're made of atoms and molecules. They're constantly buzzing. Nothing's still for a moment. And gradually everything's actually decaying. But our minds are too gross to perceive these subtle changes in external phenomena and in ourselves. So one of the axioms of Buddhist philosophy is that impermanent phenomena are the product of causes. So that these things that is changing, and that's pretty much everything, are not self-existent, independent phenomena. They're the result of a cause, of causes and conditions, actually. And labeling by the mind. So, you know, if I go too much into this, I'm going to be venturing into territories that I don't understand. So we'll just leave it at that. That there's fundamental ignorance is not understanding the nature of the self. Another universal property of sentient beings' minds is that everybody wants to be happy and not to suffer. I mean, there may be exceptions. But, you know, even people who want to suffer think that's happiness. So, so you can say that the fundamental property of the mind is to want to be happy. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself has said, you know, the purpose of life is to be happy. The question is, how do we become happy? And what is happiness? So I already said before, you know, happiness isn't changeable suffering. That's just suffering, that's suffering dressed up as happiness. But when you look into it, it's not really happiness because it doesn't last. It changes into suffering. Also, we get attached to it. It causes attachment to arise. And attachment is a negative mind. So whenever we act under the influence of attachment, we're actually creating the cause of suffering. We're creating karma. We're creating negative karma. So we have this ignorant conception of the me, you know, I, the self-existent I. And you couple that with the innate wish to be happy, and then we have this idea, you know, subconscious, I want to be happy. I want to be happy. Then we have different experiences. We have different. We experience different feelings. You know, broadly speaking, there are three kinds of feelings. There's pleasant feeling, which we want. There's unpleasant feeling, which we don't want, and there are neutral feelings, which we neither want nor don't want. So we're always chasing the pleasant feeling. So as we grow and develop, we experience various pleasant feelings. You know, our parents' love. When we're hungry, we get fed. We get that, you know, being fed, the hunger goes away. That's a pleasant feeling. Too hot, too cold. You know, when that's problem solved, it feels pleasant. Then as we get older, we have friends. We like certain kinds of food. We like to see certain things. We like different kinds of sounds. And whenever we experience pleasure, we believe that to be true pleasure, to be true happiness, and we get attached to it. So attachment is the kind of mind that wants to sink into its object and not be separated from it, like oil into paper. You know, once you get attached to something, it's difficult to separate from it. And when we do separate, something separates from it, we get angry, we get frustrated. So aversion arises. So very briefly, that's the evolution of the three poisonous minds. There's our fundamental ignorance that we were born with, that we've had since beginningless time. There's, we have different experiences of pleasure and unpleasure. When we feel pleasure, we get attached to that. When something disturbs our pleasure, or we don't get what we want, or we experience some, you know, painful or other thing, we get angry. We want to destroy that. We want to get rid of it. We never want it to happen again. Or, you know, if it's a person, we don't want to see that person again. If someone we like, we love, we want to be with that person. These are the three poisonous minds constantly working within us. And then there's, you know, as I said, there's these other branches. There's, you know, 26 delusions, generally speaking. There are a lot more than that, but so when we look at this, go ahead.
So you're saying pleasure is suffering?
Normal pleasure, the worldly pleasure that we experience is suffering. Yeah. because it doesn't last. And also we get attached to it. So attachment causes, when we act under the influence of the ignorance, attachment, aversion, that leaves imprint on our consciousness. Those actions, whether they're body, speech, or mind, they leave imprints on our consciousness, like planting seeds in the ground. So those seeds planted under the influence of ignorance, attachment, and aversion, they're the seeds of future suffering, either in this life or in a future life. And when we act under non-ignorance, non-attachment, non-aversion, we plant positive seeds in our mind, the causes of happiness. So those ripen into positive experiences. So what are you asking, Jack?
Well, that was it. The pleasure is suffering.
Pleasure is suffering in disguise. Yeah, we think it's a pleasure, but it's not real pleasure, because well, sometimes we have to create negative karma just to have that experience. We get attached to that experience. We believe that experience is true happiness. It's true pleasure. It's the purpose of life, you know, and because we get attached to it, that attachment leaves a negative imprint in our mind to experience suffering again in the future. You know, if that were as I said before, if that were the only pleasure we could experience, that would be terrible, you know, but it's not. There's a much higher, greater pleasure and happiness and content and fulfillment that we can experience through not following attachment and through recognizing the higher forms of satisfaction and pleasure that can be attained, and by creating the causes to experience those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, maybe this will clarify as we go on. So when talking about being, so the mind is impermanent, which means it is a product of causes and conditions. So when we look at a plant, for example, you know, a flower, the flower resulted from causes and conditions. The principal cause of the flower was the seed. So if it's a rose, it comes from a rose tree, which comes from a rose seed. You know, if you plant a dandelion seed, you're not going to get a rose tree, no matter how much you want roses. But the seed itself isn't enough. You put it on your table, it's not going to grow. The seed needs to go into dirt, and the dirt needs water and sunshine and minerals and whatever to grow properly. So if you want a rose tree, you have to plant an appropriate principal cause, the rose seed. So with the mind, which is formless and has the ability to perceive objects, a mind which is formless cannot come from form. You know, the principle, the main property of the mind is formlessness, which is the exact opposite of form, you know, shape, color, molecules, atoms. So a formless mind cannot come from a physical principal cause like the brain. So commonly, you know, I mean, I always grew up believing that the mind was a product of brain activity, and probably most scientists and other people still believe that, if they think about it at all. But if we understand that an effect must be similar in nature to its principal cause, we can see that a formless mind cannot come from a physical cause such as the brain. And moreover, a result, a formless mind that has the ability to perceive objects must come from principal cause that has those same properties. In other words, the mind must, as we even see now, that, as I said, the mind is just a series of thought moments, one coming after the other. So if we go back into last year, into our childhood, into the womb, where did our mind come from? When did it start functioning? At some point when we were an embryo or a fetus, or when did the mind start functioning? Has the brain developed? If that's so, what was the first thought? Does everybody have the same thought? If that thought arises by itself without cause, why does it change? What's the second thought? Is that the same for everybody? When do people start thinking differently if we all start the same? If we don't start the same, why? Is that genetic? Is our first thought depend on our parents' genes? These are unanswerable questions because they're nonsense questions. Because the mind doesn't start in the womb. The mind comes from the previous life's mind. In our previous life, we died, our body died, and our mind, our consciousness, our conscious stream continued. And when this body dies, our mind, our conscious stream will continue into the next life. And this is, and the mind is, and last life's mind, which came into this one, came from its previous life's mind. And that one came from its previous life's mind. So, and then, in fact, if you go back, there's no beginning, that the mind is beginningless.
Dr. Nick?
Yeah.
Hey, it's Vicki. How are you?
Hi, Vicki. Good, thanks.
So it seems that the terms impermanent and permanent are confusing because impermanent means changing moment by moment and permanent means not changing moment by moment, I believe. And yet the mind is actually, we could say, eternal because it has no beginning and no end, correct? So, and it is permanent in that sense.
Yeah, so the impermanent mind lasts forever. The stream of consciousness has no beginning and it has no end. Only its state it changes. It changes from, eventually, hopefully, from ignorant to enlightened. But it doesn't finish.
Right. I guess that's one thing I've never been able to understand.
Well, you have to distinguish between using words kind of colloquially and technically.
Right, but what I was going to say was, like His Holiness and, well, Buddhism teaches there's no Atman or self, like in Hinduism, but in a way, I don't see the difference because the self or the I is a permanent something, which you cannot see if you're dissected, just like you cannot see the permanent mind if the body is dissected. And they're both something which leads us towards enlightenment through development. if you
So
follow my.
both what?
Well, the mind is, we're working on the mind to lead ourselves towards enlightenment, correct?
We are, yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess theoretically it's sort of the same with the Atman, or the so-called permanent self.
Yeah, there's no such thing though. From a Buddhist point of view, there's no such thing as a Atman or permanent self. The self that exists is not the self that we normally believe in. What we look, our ignorant mind looks at our body-mind combination, and Buddhism calls this the five aggregates or the five skandhas. You've heard of that term? Five aggregates?
Yes.
That a sentient being, samsaric sentient being has five aggregates. It has the physical aggregate, the aggregate of form, and then it has four mental aggregates of feeling, cognition, compositional factors, and consciousness. And so, with mind, we have principle, and mind or consciousness are synonymous terms. So, mind means consciousness, consciousness means mind. So we have we have six principal consciousnesses, which are the five sense consciousness: sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch, and the mental consciousness. So we have six principal consciousness, and we have 20 secondary minds. Or mental factors. Sorry, we have 51 mental factors. 20, as I said before, 20 secondary delusions. So the 51, so six principal consciousness and 51 mental factors. So there are five ever present, there are five determining, there are 11 positive, there are six principal delusions, there are 20 secondary delusions, and there are four changeable mental factors. So that adds up to 51. Maybe one day we can look at those. But that's what the mind, when we talk about the mind, it's not just this one kind of static it's not this one thing. It has all these different aspects to it. So principle and six principal kinds, 51 secondary minds. Sorry, I've lost your question, Vicky.
Well, I guess it might be a translation problem, but it just seems like when we say the mind is impermanent and we mean changing moment by moment, it gives the impression when you say impermanent that it's not eternal, that it's not from beginningless time with no end.
No, well, that's why I distinguish between gross and subtle impermanence. The mind is subtly impermanent, but it's not grossly impermanent in that it eventually finishes, like a car or a tree, and the car and the tree never really finish. They just disintegrate into their component parts, which eventually get smaller and smaller, and but don't disappear. Then they, a tree becomes a car in, a future universe, and vice versa, Impermanent mind can go on forever. It's just changing from moment to moment. If the enlightened mind is impermanent, in that, enlightened mind sees all this impermanence going on. It's, not that I can say what the enlightened mind sees, but enlightenment isn't a static state. The enlightened mind is also impermanent. It's also a product of causes. Its principal cause is bodhicitta. And then, you know, the conditions are all the practices we do to develop wisdom and so on and so forth, compassion.
I've never heard that the enlightened mind is still changing.
Well, it's not becoming ignorant. It's just you know, when we're talking about levels of mind, when we talk about beings that have a mind, there are two kinds of beings that have mind. There are enlightened beings and sentient beings. The difference is that enlightened beings have eliminated every last vestige of ignorance from their mind, completely gone. That's why it's called enlightened, because there's not a trace of ignorance left. The enlightened beings were once like us, sentient beings, but because they practiced Dharma and eradicated ignorance from their mind, they became enlightened. Once ignorance is gone, it can't come back because there's nothing for it to come back from. There's no cause. Ignorance comes from previous ignorance. If there is no ignorance, it can't come back. Now, amongst sentient beings who do have ignorance in their mind, there are two levels of ignorance. There's gross ignorance and subtle ignorance. You know, sentient beings who have eliminated gross ignorance, the three poisons, delusion and karma, from their mind, they're not yet enlightened. They're liberated from cyclic existence, the 6 realms of samsara. They're liberated, they're free, they're arhats, but they're not yet enlightened because they still have the imprint of enlightenment. Remember the burnt onions in the pot? Did you hear that?
Yes.
So, you know, if we burn onions in a pot, at first it's this black, ugly mess. So when you clean out the gross, ugly mess, the pot looks clean, but if you smell it, you can still smell where the burnt onions were. So with gross ignorance, even if we eradicate that by realizing the ultimate nature of the self, we get rid of gross ignorance, but the imprints that ignorance, beginningless ignorance, has left on our mind still exist. So Tibetan terms are nyundrip and shedrip. There's the drip means obscuration or obstruction. So there's the nyundrip, the obstructions due to delusion, which keep us in cyclic existence. And then there's shedrip, the obstructions to knowledge, which are the imprints of the gross delusions, the imprints that beginningless ignorance, you know, the burnt onions, have left on our mind. So even though we've attained liberation, we still have work to do. So we realize the ultimate nature of our own mind. We're liberated from cyclic existence. We're no longer under the control of delusion and karma, but we still have the imprints. So then we have to work to understand we've understood the ultimate nature of our own mind. Then we have to work to understand the ultimate nature of all other phenomena, of all other sentient beings. So we have to eradicate that subtle ignorance. So once we've done that and attained enlightenment, all ignorance is gone. There's no way we can fall back into ignorance because there's nowhere it can come from. So we're samsaric sentient beings chasing under the influence of, you know, belief in the self, under the control of attachment. When we don't get what we want, we get angry. Even though all we want is happiness, all we want is happiness, all we do is create the cause of suffering because we don't understand what is happiness, we don't understand what is suffering. And we believe suffering to be happiness, changeable suffering to be happiness. And we believe that we really exist the way we feel, the way we've always felt we exist. We don't understand reality. We don't understand the ultimate reality, the nature of the self. We don't understand conventional reality, karma. We don't understand cause and effect. We don't understand which causes lead to which effect, which effects come from which causes. That's why we know something's going on that we don't understand. And we've tried all these different methods of samsara, education, reading all these books, absorbing all these different sources of knowledge. And we've come to understanding like the Buddha did. We still don't understand. So now we've turned to something new, the study of Dharma, something we weren't taught in school, we weren't taught by our parents probably. Somehow our curiosity, our dissatisfaction with the status quo has led us to Thupten Khunga Center. So, you probably won't get the answers from me, but if we finally get round to looking at this text, maybe we'll get some answers. But I think that's it, isn't it? Okay, so maybe we'll hit the subject a little more deeply next time, next Sunday. But any last wishes? Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll continue next week if you're interested. And so normally we conclude by remembering that we generated the highest positive motivation at the beginning, bodhicitta. We've hopefully been talking about the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma. So through right motivation, right action, we've created positive energy, positive karma, we call merit, the cause of happiness and success. So to prevent that merit from being destroyed by ignorance, anger, and so forth, we dedicate it, we confirm its direction to the enlightenment of all sentient beings by thinking, each of us, because of this merit, may I quickly reach enlightenment in order to enlighten all sentient beings. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nick. If everyone wants to unmute or say anything, please feel free.
Thank you, Dr. Rinpoche. We appreciate your presence.
Yeah, just call me Nick.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, Nick.
Okay.